Okay, Rick Hamilton Brandenburg here, and today we have a very special guest I'm super excited about. Our guest today not only graduated from MIT, if I remember correctly, it's the only college that he applied to. He's had a lot of careers. He is trained as an aerospace engineer. He was the CEO of a soft drink bottling business. He was a fee only financial planner back before that was really cool and everybody was getting into it. And he is most well known for pioneering his research on the question of how much can people safely withdraw from their investments so that they don't run out in retirement. So join me in welcoming Bill Bengen to our podcast.
Great
Yeah,
to
it's
be
not
here. Thank you.
Awesome.
so I'm no longer the smartest guy in the room. Is that what you're talking about?
Well, you never were to begin with, but definitely not now.
You're listening to Advised with Rick Lucchini.
So I'm just so excited to talk to you today. And Rick and I are going to try to not keep you on for 8 hours because we could just listen to you all day long. We're going to
Hey,
cover a lot
I
of
got
ground.
nothing to do, so I'll
That's,
just cancel all my tennis and golf and just sit here and talk to you guys.
that sounds awesome. Today we're going to learn about, you've got a new book coming out. We're going to talk about the 4% rule and how that started and what it really is. But really, before we start off with that, so you were a financial advisor. You got into the business in the late 80s and early 90s. And why don't you just tell us if a normal person had gone to a financial advisor when you had just started and asked the question, how much can I safely take out of my investments to live off of in retirement? What kind of questions would they be, what kind of answers would they be getting from their advisors?
Well, I suspect they would have gotten a quizzical look, and then kind of a scramble, because in that time the internet didn't exist, so you wouldn't be able to go to the internet to get answers. I was asked those same questions. I gave my clients the same quizzical look and said, "I'll get back to you." And so I went to my CFP bookshelf, and there were no answers there. I went to the library. There was no internet, so I looked all the financial publications. Nothing on that topic at all. I was getting kind of desperate at this point, so I called up some of my more experienced financial advisors in the San Diego area where I lived, and they really tried to be helpful, but their answers were all over the map. And it occurred to me in a flash that, gosh, nobody knows the answers to these questions I'm asking, my clients are asking. So I think I'm going to have to find them out for myself. So, being a trained engineer, I sat down in front of my computer with my spreadsheets and a whole book of investment returns going back to 1926, and I started cranking numbers. That's how it all began.
Why do you think that is? Is it because back then people weren't accustomed to living off their savings, so it wasn't as big of a deal? There was a lot more pensions and stuff back then, or what was the reasoning that no one was really giving this any serious thought?
Yeah, I think a combination of both. I think, back in the late 80s, for the first time, people were really facing long life expectancies and therefore
Yeah,
long retirements. In the 50s, people retired and within 5 years they were gone. So,
yeah.
they could take out 20% if they wanted to. They didn't care, assuming they even had a savings account available to them. But when you get into the 90s, people were starting to get IRAs, starting to think seriously about saving for retirements, and pensions, were slowly starting to go by the wayside and be replaced by 401ks, and self development retirement plans. So it was a combination of things, but boy, it came on like gangbusters.
Yeah.
Yeah, it did. So tell us what really is the 4% rule? I've heard it misquoted more often than not. And I'd like to hear from the horse's mouth. What really is the 4% rule?
Sure. I think it was an outgrowth. I published my first paper in 1994. It was a very tentative thing. My idea was to do a very simple portfolio with just one asset class stocks and one bond asset class, and basically answer the question: if you want to be conservative and you wanted to guarantee from a historical perspective that you'd be able to last for 30 years of retirement with your money, what withdrawal rate would you use? What would have been the lowest, safe withdrawal rate, using the term safe in quotes, from a historical perspective? And that number turned out to be 4.15%. which is an awful number. I hate that 5 in there because, who believes anything beyond the first decimal point?
Right.
But I printed the article, I published it, and I sat back and I said, well, I hope somebody reads this thing. And all of a sudden, I'm reading newspaper articles about Bill Bengen's 4% rule. And I'd never used the term rule in that paper, and I used 4.15%, not 4%. But, when things like that get out in the public domain, they just get out of control. And basically, that's how it got started and how it's continued, on till today. Even though my recent research, I've raised that up to 4.7%. People still like the simplicity of the 4%, I think.
It's still definitely the most common answer. If you Google how much can I withdraw from my investments in retirement, it's going to be a billion articles about the 4% rule. I think that's phenomenal. How did you use this with your own clients? Because you were a practicing financial advisor, you weren't just doing research. When you were working with families, were you always using 4% as a guideline, or were you sometimes adjusting that up or down depending on other life factors that they had going on?
Well, I really had a dilemma because I knew from my research that historically, 4.7% was very low. In fact, I was studying hundreds of retirees, and only one retiree had a withdrawal rate that low. Most of them were higher. The average over the last 100 years, believe it or not, is over 7%.
Wow.
And there were some people who were really lucky, were able to get double-digit withdrawal rates, and some as high as 16%. So I knew that there were opportunities to withdraw a lot of that. That was an ultra-conservative approach to things, and that if you used it, the odds were you were just going to accumulate a lot of wealth during retirement because you didn't withdraw enough, and maybe have regrets after 20 or 30 years that you didn't spend more. The problem was, how do we access those higher withdrawal rates? On what do we base, a decision to say, well, 5% is safe now, or 6%, or 7%? And that took me over 20 years, 25 years to actually come to somewhat of a scientific conclusion as to how to actually recommend high withdrawal rates with some confidence.
And how you invest makes a big difference too, and how sustainable your withdrawal rate is, I would imagine. So has that portion, I know you started with the one asset class in stocks and the one in bonds. Has your opinion changed on how people should be invested to sustain their withdrawal rates over time?
Yeah, in 2006, I added another asset class, small U.S. small cap stocks, so that bumped it up to 4.5%. And then several years ago, I added 4 more asset classes, including international stocks, U.S. mid-cap stocks, U.S. micro-cap stocks, and that got it up to 4.7%. I suspect we're kind of reaching a limit around 5%, but that's a lot higher than the 4.15%, that I came out with. So I've changed my numbers primarily because my research has gotten more sophisticated and my portfolios have become more representative of a diversified portfolio.
I bet doing research is a lot easier nowadays with the internet. How long did it take you to study to publish the 4% rule? I mean, that must have been like hundreds or thousands of hours.
Yeah, my current book, I started working on it in fall of 2023. And I'm sure there are 12 to 1,500 hours of computation alone in there, I think, in addition to the writing. It's massive. But I'm very pleased with it because I express all my findings in charts. And I really got a lot of neat charts, dozens, even, over 100 neat charts in the book, which aren't hard to follow. They illustrate concepts, I think, in a very straightforward manner, and are actually kind of fun to read. They illustrate, for example, let's say instead of for 30 years, you want to plan for 40 years or 50 years, or maybe just 10. I've got a chart which running from 0 years to 50, showing you what your withdrawal rate should be. And it varies dramatically, particularly when you get to very short planning horizons, like 10 years and 5 years. You can take very high withdrawal rates. But interestingly, as you go out longer, like a lot of the FIRE people would like to do, 40, 50 years,
Sure.
The withdrawal rate comes down, but it kind of reaches a floor. And it doesn't go much below 4.1%. And it just kind of stays there. I imagine for 100 or 200 year retirement horizon, that's what it would be.
That's awesome.
That's actually really interesting, and that should be a point of confidence for those retirees that are taking maybe a lower withdrawal rate. Maybe they don't need as much cash flow, but are still worried all the time about the market and their future. Something you just said just jumped off the page. I mean, you get down to that 4.15%, and
Yeah,
you're saying that theoretically could be sustainable for 100 years.
that's right. Right.
Yeah, that's
Exactly.
wild.
Yeah. Of course, who knows what the world will be like
Well,
in
right.
100 years. My
Right.
research, to be straightforward, is based on historical results.
Sure.
And we can never be sure that what happened in history will be accurately representative of what happens in the future. But so far, it's been pretty accurate. So,
Yeah. So, Bill, what you had mentioned about raising those rates a little bit, and I think even just recent market history is going to support that. Um, Talking about maybe spending more of your own money, not having that regret about taking less than the 4.15. Do you still see this? Do you see this rule, or I just say rule, this standard, as more of someone who's DIYing, or more of a set it and forget it mentality, and maybe with closer work with an advisor or something, they could take more out dynamically because they're changing it all the time? Or is this something that should be done with advisors as well?
yeah, I think you can work with your advisor on it. The 4.7% rule, which is now the lowest withdrawal rate historically I've been able to determine for a 30-year plan, is ultra conservative. It applies to only one retiree out of 400. The odds are your withdrawal rate is going to be higher. If you're withdrawing today, I estimate it might be 5.25 to 5.5.
Okay.
Still well below the average of 7%, but we're in a time when stock markets are very expensive. We're probably facing a big stock market decline at some point, and when they occur early in retirement, those events tend to reduce your withdrawal rates drastically. So that's why it's only 5.25, 5.5%. But still, that's a lot better than 4.7.
Oh, absolutely.
Sure.
Makes a huge difference. Now, I want to ask you about your book, and you kind of hit a little bit on this, but tell me, why did you decide to revisit it? I mean, you just said you spent, thousands, over 1,200 to 1,500 hours in research. I'm kind of curious, what made you want to reopen the topic and dive back into it?
I guess I'm addicted. I'm obsessed with this topic. It's that I've gone through several research cycles. Probably every 4 or 5 years, I revisit the topic, and every time I dive back in, I find something new and interesting. Market conditions maybe have added some new information, or maybe there's something I got to look into I didn't look into before. So it's kind of like exploring Mars. You never know what you're going to find beyond the next hill, and it's constantly endlessly fascinating, and it's a thrill for me.
That's awesome. That's encouraging. So let's talk about your book. Tell us, your book is called A Richer Retirement: Supercharging the 4% Rule. Rick, I went ahead and took the liberty of already pre-ordered 2 copies, one for me and one for you.
Thank
So,
you. Thank you.
so I'm really excited about this. Tell us about your book.
Yeah, my book is basically a distillation of 30 years of my research. And essentially, you can think of it as a cookbook.
Okay.
Think of it as a recipe for creating your own personal retirement withdrawal plan. It's not written for professionals, it's written for the general public. And it goes through the steps that, as you would in a recipe. First, we collect all the ingredients. And the prime ingredients are, first, what I consider the 8 elements, which are factors that you can use to customize your plan for your own personal preference. These include things like your asset allocation, how long a plan you want to have, what type of account you're using, taxable or tax deferred, and so on, other factors like that. And then there are 2 other very important factors before you can actually get to the number. We all want to get to a number at some point. What is my withdrawal rate? I've discovered, particularly 3 years ago, that there are 2 determinants of what your withdrawal rate is going to be are stock market valuation. Because if you're close to a bear market, and a bear market happens early in retirement, it's going to hit you, going to reduce your withdrawal rate, and also inflation. inflation is probably as important as a bear markets. People talk about sequence of return risk, where are unlucky early in retirement, get hit hard. Retired in 1929 October, and you went through 3 years of a 90% bear market. That's really a tale of woe. But equally bad can be if you retire in the late 60s and face a period of 12 years of very high inflation, many double-digit years, because under the withdrawal system, the 4.7% rule uses, you give yourself a cost of living adjustment each year, just like Social Security. And if inflation is 10%, and that you have to increase that by 10% each year,
Oh yeah.
it's really eating into your portfolio very, very harshly. So those factors, they're really the 8 elements: inflation and the valuation of the stock market, are the 10
Yep.
factors you need to set your number. But once you set your plan up with those factors, you can't just let it sit. It's a 30-year plan. And who expects a 30-year plan not to run into some speed bumps along the way? When
Absolutely.
NASA sends a rocket to Jupiter, they don't just launch it and forget it. They say, oh, it'll be fine. We don't have to do anything, because it's very complicated, the relationship between gravity and everything of all the planets out there. So they're constantly making mid-course adjustments. It's possible in retirement that some of the assumptions you made may not work out, and you may have to adjust your plan during retirement. And I have a whole long chapter in that book which looks into case studies of something going wrong or apparently going wrong with your plan, and suggesting ways that you can fix it so you can get back on track, which I think is very interesting and useful to folks.
I do too. I hope I'm not jumping in, Rick, but I wanted to let me ask you about that. So obviously, I'm not asking you to give me the whole book for free over a podcast episode, but like when you're talking about making adjustments to that spending plan in retirement, would you be using those same kind of 8 elements of getting your withdrawal rate correct and kind of monitoring those things like stock market valuation and how much longer do we expect to be in retirement before we've concluded it? And you're kind of using those as your decision points to help you decide when you need to adjust how much you're taking out, or are you looking at other things?
Sure. I recommend that as part of the plan at the start, that people develop what I call a chart, which tracks theoretically what your withdrawal rate should be each of the 30 years of retirement. I call it the current withdrawal rate chart. It's basically just your withdrawal dollar amount divided by the value of the portfolio at the start of the year. And since we're starting at maybe 5%, let's say, and we're going to end up at zero, right? Because we're assuming that after 30 years, we're going to have a zero balance. So the last year, it has to be 100% the withdrawal rate. So we're going to go from 5 to 100 on a smooth curve, and each year it's going to increase a little bit. So that curve is going to be your template. That's what you're going to measure. And then you take your actual experience with your portfolio, you calculate your actual current withdrawal rate, and see how that measures up against what's on that chart. And if it diverges significantly, then you have to reach a decision point. And you have to ask some questions. Let's say, for example, early in retirement, you unexpectedly run into a heavy bear market. And you look at your current withdrawal chart, and you're way behind the template chart, which you had set up with your plan. Should you do anything? Well, my experience with bear markets, as I point out in the book, is that you're probably better off doing nothing. Just let it sit, because bear markets come, bear markets go. They're usually followed by a very substantial recovery. And historically, almost always in those situations, your portfolio will recover, and your chart will then start matching or approximating your template chart. So you don't have to worry. Doing nothing in that situation actually works out, which is welcome news, because that's the easiest thing to do nothing. However, let's say your chart is divergent because you hit a big bout of unexpected inflation, double digit, nasty stuff. Your withdrawals are going off the chart, and you find that your current withdrawal rate chart is running away from the chart that you had set up as part of your plan. Doing nothing is not an option in that situation. Inflation is the greatest enemy of retirees. And my recommendation in the book is that when you look like you have inflation that has become semi-permanent and at a high level, you should panic. You should actually plan to withdraw your withdrawal rate or reduce your withdrawal rates very significantly, and be prepared to do some further if the inflation continues. If you don't,
That
it will
is,
devastate, it will completely devastate your portfolio. There is no recovery from inflation because once you raise the withdrawal rates, they're locked in. You're not likely to have a period like the 1930s where you had 10% deflation every
mm,
year. That's probably not going to happen.
yeah.
So that's why what's going on now, we're watching inflation carefully. The Federal Reserve, is watching inflation carefully. It's very, very dangerous for retirees, and I hope they stay on top of it.
That's so interesting too, because I think that's so counterintuitive to what like the average layman's response would be. Typically I think people who are not deep in the weeds in this stuff, like you are, would say, oh, you really need to try to avoid the bear markets, jump in, jump out. But what you're saying is, you probably need to set your allocation and not be as worried about bear markets as you are about inflation. And inflation is a thing
That's
that should
true.
give you cause for concern.
That's true. Although I want to add something. I used to be a buy and hold investor when I was accumulating money for retirement.
Sure.
Now that I'm retired, my opinion, people should convert to some kind of a risk management approach, use a third party service that will adjust their portfolio allocation to stocks during difficult times. My motto is if you're in retirement, protect your nest egg at all costs. Don't let a 2008 style bear market devastate you.
Mm.
We were lucky back then, and that the Federal Reserve and the other central banks of the world stepped in, flooded the world with liquidity, and the stock markets recovered very quickly. That may not happen the next time. It may take years. If you remember, after the bear market and the depression took the stock market 25 years to get back to where it had been. Even if it takes 5 or 7 years to get back, your portfolio is going to really feel the effects.
Mm.
So I recommend people find a reliable third-party risk manager to help them adjust their stock equity allocation during retirement, and don't let their portfolio get trashed during really bad bear markets. It's just too painful.
And it's so hard to be objective too if you're not using a third party. If you're doing it all yourself, it's very hard to be objective when you're also in panic mode, I would imagine.
It's easy for your emotions to get engaged, and then you're really in trouble.
Do you talk in your book about some of that, like risk management principles or investment principles? Because I remember in reading your original withdrawal rate paper, if I remember correctly, at that time you had talked about having 50 as a minimum to 70 up to 75% allocation
Uh-huh.
to stocks as kind of what you saw as the sweet spot. And you tended, if I remember correctly, the tone of your paper was a little more geared towards, hey, 75% is probably, a little bit better income over time, but it does have some extra up and down risk. So do you kind of talk about how the soup is made and like how people should be managing risk and picking investments in your upcoming book?
Yeah, I have a section on risk management. I mentioned the firm that I use. I don't receive any compensation for them. It's not an endorsement. It's just a suggestion. There are other firms, other services that people can use. I recommend they research them and find out something they're comfortable with. The main thing I recommend is to do something. Although all my research is based on a buy and hold, because it's very difficult to analyze things otherwise.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that I'm recommending or endorsing a buy and hold strategy. In fact, quite the opposite. During retirement, I think you need to be an active manager of your portfolio with help.
Yeah, it's very, very difficult to model any other kind of an active strategy, because before you know it,
It really is.
you could trick yourself into always picking the winners and dodging the losers, and then you're just telling
Yeah,
yourself what you want to hear, right? So
that's right.
what do you think are some of the you hit on this with inflation, like in today's environment in 2025, if someone was retiring right now, what do you think are some of those biggest risks that they are facing as they look down potentially a 30-year or greater retirement?
Well, the biggest problem we've had over the last 25 years at the stock market, except for a few months during the middle of 2009, has been quite overvalued. And in my methodology, an overvalued stock market really reduces the initial withdrawal rate, knocks it way down.
Mm.
Um, 2009 April was probably a fabulous time to invest. I calculate that the withdrawal rate from there could have been as high as 8%, believe it or not.
Wow.
But it only lasted for a few quarters. And we're back down into the fives again because the stock market has risen so high. It's difficult for me because I use historical data, and to a certain extent, over the last 20 years, we've been in uncharted territory. We've been at record levels of stock market valuation, never attained before. Even in 1929, we didn't get this high. So we don't have much data to indicate what might be coming next, and probably be another 5, 10 years before, with confidence, I can analyze some of the stuff and say, yeah, this withdrawal rate is associated with the stock market valuation like that. But all the indications I have is that, for today, if I was retiring today, I'd probably want to do no more than maybe 5.25% from a tax deferred account, less, from a taxable account. And that's disappointing because the historical average has been 7. So these high stock market valuations feel good, but they're not so great for retirees at all.
No.
Well, and that can be part of the problem or just confusion, which is when I'm looking back and I'm taking that data from history, and this is with your study, with everything that we do, really, because we always are somehow leaning on history to make future projections. Is the stock market overvalued and that should reduce my rate for all the reasons that it could be? Or is this the new norm? Are these valuations going to hold up? Because over 15 years they have. We don't actually know that, but that's one of those questions that we might be able to look back and say, wow, good thing we kept it lower because this was overvalued and we had to pay the price, or this was the new norm because of instant trades and 401ks and everything. And maybe we can lift it back up closer to 7.
Yeah, it's interesting. If you look at a table of the Shiller cyclically adjusted PE ratio, which is a tool I use to measure stock market valuation, created by Professor Robert Shiller at Yale. And there are spikes in it, particularly over the last 30 years. But I've never seen anything on the chart where the ratio has gotten very high and then stayed there at a plateau for 5, 6, 7 years. When it got very high, it almost immediately comes back down in a spike formation. So unless history is different this time, the very high levels we are at right now will eventually be followed by pretty significant and rapid decline in valuations. I just can't predict when that'll happen.
Yeah, it's always hard to predict a down market, right? And I always tell people, like, that's why you need to have a down market strategy before things are bad and decide how you're going to behave and what you'll do, because it's if you don't, it's kind of like trying to put a roof on your house in a rainstorm, right? It's hard to do in the middle.
It's very hard to predict that stuff. I think John Kenneth Galbraith, a famous economist, once said that the only purpose of financial forecasting is to make astrology look credible. And I think that's true. We're dealing with so many variables that can operate in so many different ways. It's really tough.
So as somebody who studied aerospace and all things space, you're telling me astrology is not credible. All right, I got that. I'll check that.
Okay, I don't want to offend any of your listeners, but I don't use it.
That's okay. You're allowed to offend them, Bill.
By the way, I'm a library.
That's right. That's right. So what would you say are some of the important steps that if a family is like 5 years from when they want to retire, what do they need to start doing now to make sure that they are set up for a successful 30-year retirement?
That's a really great question. I would hope that up to that point, they would have been heavily investing in stocks in their portfolio, trying to accumulate as much capital as possible. I'm honestly, I don't see for younger folks, for any reason, have anything but 100% in equities, up to about 5 years within retirement.
Agreed.
Yep, definitely.
When you get within 5 years of retirement, it makes sense to start assessing, how does the stock market valuation look, right now? Should I take some money temporarily off the table, soften my portfolio, include some bonds? If the stock market is cheap, just keep letting it run. The goal is to accumulate as much as you can. But if you're in a period of time, let's say today, you were 5 years from retirement, I think you should be taking one of those risk management services seriously, reducing your exposure to equities, and hoping that before retirement, you get a stock market crash. That's what you're hoping for, so that you can then throw more money in and get up to what you plan to have during retirement, which might be 50, 60, 70%, equities. Okay. Although I want to mention something a very interesting idea two other financial planners developed called the rising glide path. Have you ever heard of that?
Yeah, tell me about it.
Okay. Basically, the concept behind that is you don't start retirement with 60 or 70% fixed allocation.
Okay.
What you're going to do, you're going to vary your asset allocation in retirement. You're going to start with a relatively low allocation, let's say 40%, increase it maybe by 1.5%, 2% a year. And if you do that and you apply it to historical results, you find out that adds about 0.25% to your withdrawal rate on average, which is phenomenal.
Wow.
And, it's so counterintuitive to think, gosh, I'm going to start at a low withdrawal rate and have a low percentage of stocks and have it for a number of years. Well, when you think about it, one of the greatest problems we have is the stock market early in retirement,
Sure.
a crash. And if you're at 40% stocks when the crash happens instead of 70% stocks, you're going to save a lot of money.
Yep.
Yeah.
You're going to look very good. And then you'll be buying stocks, you'll be increasing your stock allocation into a rising stock market recovery. So that's their explanation for it. I accept it. It's very interesting. I tested across my entire database of 400 retirees, and it works in just about every case.
Wow.
So I think that's one of what I call one of the 4 free lunches that are available to retirees to improve their withdrawal rate is to use a rising equity glide path. It's a very interesting idea.
Especially if
So
they're comfortable with that smaller withdrawal rate in the beginning and it meets their cash flow needs. Totally. What were you going to say, Rick?
Well, I was just going to say that is interesting because what you're really doing is dramatically reducing the sequence of return risk in the early years and then dollar cost averaging back into the stock market. Because we all know, we're all sitting here knowing that over a long period of time, the stocks are going to outperform. But but once you start withdrawing, you have these windows that you can't afford the short-term volatility. And that sort of sidesteps that in a way.
Exactly. I think that's a pretty darn good description of how that thing works.
Interesting. Yeah, that is very interesting. I've got one that we were talking about the withdrawals before, and just quickly, kind of, how do you see that? What you're doing now, how you've changed things in a slightly more dynamic approach. How do you view that against Guyton's dynamic withdrawal? And we call it guardrails. How close and how similar or how different are those two, and what's the pros and cons as the way you see it?
Yeah, Jonathan's a good friend. For this book, I just didn't have time to analyze his approach in detail. I plan to do that, over the next year or so. Okay. But to me, anything that can help reduce stock market risk of a big downtown is probably going to be beneficial to you.
Yeah.
The paper he published seemed to indicate, it really improves situations. I like to do my own version of that and report back to you.
I would love you to. Yeah, I would love you to, because Hamilton and I both subscribe to some modified version of that with our clients. And it's very interesting because it's a lot of what you're talking about and some slight differences, basically going to some version of a dynamic approach. We believe, we all three of us agree, is necessary because, like you said, a lot can happen and a lot can change over a 30-year retirement. What those factors are that you're determining make the changes can be slightly different, but it's very similar in the way that you're not allowed to just set it and forget it, because you can either easily run out of money while you're sleeping at the wheel, or you could easily not spend enough of your money and die with a big balance.
Sure.
Yep.
That's awesome. I think Rick is trying to volunteer both of us to be research assistants for your third book. For your next book.
I really do. I'm very interested in that and how the two stack up side by side. It's awesome.
Definitely. I have a question that is maybe more soft skill and less analytical. I'm just kind of curious how you handle this in your practice, or how you tell advisors to handle it now. We do spend a lot of time thinking about maximum withdrawal rates, right? How much is the most you can take out? Because as the studies have shown, people do want to spend as much as they can for those first, 10 years in retirement when they're healthiest and they're youngest. What would your word be to somebody who is having a difficult time spending their maximum withdrawal rate. In other words, they're wanting to spend 2.5 or 3%, and they're greatly underspending. Maybe that's because of fear or uncertainty. Like, is that a problem that you face with your clients where they didn't want to spend the full amount that they could have, or is that just like me with some
Yeah, that is a
one-offs?
legitimate problem. I remember clients like that. And it's funny, I had a discussion with somebody like that the other day. They said, I like your research, Bill, but I'm so conservative. I'm just not spending the levels you're recommending. And I'll probably end up being buried in a solid gold casket. And I said to this person, look, there's a couple of things you think of. Life doesn't last forever. You can't take it with you. And, you really need to enjoy your money while you have it. The other thing is that, please, solid gold caskets are really tough on pallbearers. So please, at least think of your pallbearers if nobody else.
Maybe they didn't like their family and they were going to volunteer them to be the pallbearers. I like that, a plan. That's awesome.
Yeah, we've talked about that before, and it's something that we both see in our practices because we're dealing with, middle class savers, conservative folks, that the reason they've amassed all this wealth is because they lived within or under their means. They've saved all this, and now it's scary to see it be reduced at all. Yeah. And it is a important thing, is we're always worried so much about the math and how to maximize this, but getting them to actually use the money and enjoy it is a whole different skill set.
It really is. That's a very difficult issue and probably almost beyond the scope of my research,
Yeah.
But it's an issue that it needs to be addressed. A lot of people are not spending enough, and I honestly don't know how you convince them to spend if they don't want to. I know I had some of my early clients, parents were children of the Great Depression,
Yeah.
and they just didn't believe in spending money at all. They didn't believe in taking on debt for any reason. They had a difficult time dealing with the stock market,
Yeah.
So it was hard for them, but you can understand, what their generation or the prior generation went through. That's tough to overcome.
Absolutely.
I think what you're doing though is one of the ways to help that along, because the more, folks like Hamilton and I can sit down and show the work, show why we're suggesting that amount rather than just, I know it, I'm the smart guy, do it. The more we can give them trust in their safety nets built into this. That's why it's 4.75 and not 7.45. That's why we're reducing it, in the future if the market goes down, depending on which, you use. The more you can show them the work and convince them that at this number, you likely don't run out of money when you're older, I think the more you can encourage them to start thinking about things to use it for, because that's the worry. Yeah, he told me I can spend that, but really in the back of my mind, when I get in the car and go home, I'm really thinking that's too scary. I'll just wait another 2 years.
Yeah, I think you're right. I used to sit down with them and try to give them a history lesson. I say, let's go back to 1929, 1930, 1931. For the person who retired in October of 1929, at the very beginning of a 90% decline in stocks, which was the worst in the last 100 years, their withdrawal rate was still 5.8%.
Wow.
Now, why would it be so much higher than the person in 1968? They didn't have a 90% decline in stocks. Well, what happened is that they had this huge inflation increase.
Yeah.
While in the 1930s, they had 10% deflation every year. That offset a lot of the stock market decline. So I said, if you're worried about the 1930s coming back, bring it on, because you can do better than 4.7%. A lot more. You should wish for a return of the 19th. Well, nobody really wants that. But I said, if that's your fear, that's not what you have to be afraid of. You have to be concerned about 1968, and that wasn't even on their radar.
That's huge. It's never the thing that's on our radar, right? So where can our listeners learn more about your book and go ahead and secure a copy of it?
Sure. Almost all the major online booksellers now have pre-orders on their websites for the book. You can either enter my name or, a richer retirement, and it should come up, and they can pre-order the book. I think if you're a Barnes and Noble member this week, ending today, you can get an additional 25% discount. So,
Oh, nice.
uh,
Is
but
there an audio version narrated by yourself?
not yet.
You got to
Uh,
do that.
Yeah,
I'm a listener.
we,
I like to
we want
listen.
to hear
I'm
your
not,
okay,
voice
I'm
yeah,
not
there
into
are a
much of a
lot of
this.
reader.
people. Yeah, the problem with the audio version, I discussed this with my publisher just the other day, is this my book has 150 charts and tables,
Yeah.
and they're referenced, and it's very difficult
Yeah.
to listen to a
Yeah.
book
That's a good
which
point.
has
Yeah.
so many charts and tables because I'm constantly referring to charts and pictures. So
I don't think anybody's interesting enough to read a chart to me and keep my attention.
okay, well, sure at the left there's a wiggly line that goes down here. No,
That's right.
you don't want to hear that.
That's right. Well, man, that is awesome. Well, Bill, I know we're coming up on time. I am just so grateful to you for talking with Rick and I today. I know I speak for both of us that I can't think of another person whose work and whose research has contributed as much to the financial planning profession, to the confidence and security of people, millions of Americans who are retiring every year and going into retirement knowing with certainty what their cash flow is going to be. So thank you so much for all your work that you're continuing to do. And thank you so much for joining us on the show today.
That's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, buddy.